lost control.
I never had it to start with. All right, probably many of you have noticed we're starting VBS today, and so Dennis is not going to teach the class today. He volunteered me to do this particular lesson. I think we'll probably figure out why when we get into it. But we're scheduled. All the classes in the back are looking at the same thing this morning, and the lesson revolves around the world in which Noah lived, and it's a comparison between his world and our world today. And the lesson does that in two different ways. It does it from a physical standpoint, but it also does it from a spiritual standpoint. And so I thought in our class this morning, I want to concentrate on the physical aspect, and then, Lord willing, in our sermon, we can look at the spiritual side of things a little bit differently than what they looked at in the back. So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning, and I'd like to do it like a Bible class. I'm standing up here because of this fan. If it were down there, I'd be standing on the floor, but it's up here, so I'm up here, and I got a lot of material. I don't think I'll probably make it through all of it. No, that surprises everybody, but there's a lot of information about the world in which Noah lived, and the relevance to science today, and the relevance to biblical teaching too. And so when we think of the world, and I'm talking about the physical world, the earth, I think we often have a tendency, and I say this a lot, but I think it's true. We're kind of egocentric in our thinking. We kind of think the way things are now is the way they've always been, right? It might blow somebody's mind to think, well, the church didn't always assemble twice on Sundays. What do you mean they didn't? This is the way it's always been, right? Because that's how we're doing it now. But there are numerous things in our world that are like that today. But this morning I want to think of it in relation to our physical world. Because when we look around us today, we kind of just think about, well, this is the way the earth has always been. But of course the Bible doesn't teach that, and scientific evidence also that has been discovered indicates that the world in which we live today is much different than a world that existed in times past. And so I want you to take your Bibles and turn over to 2 Peter chapter 3 with me, and this is what we're going to be thinking about. Sorry, it won't work. Just a second. There we go. All right, 2 Peter chapter 3, and like I said, I'd like to do this like a class, have a little bit of discussion here. So if I can, let's get somebody to read verses 6 and 7 for us there. 2 Peter 3, verses 6 and 7.
By which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men.
Okay, so Peter was writing about, really his emphasis there in 2 Peter 3 is God's going to do whatever he says he's going to do. God's word, when God says something, it happens. And he's using the illustration. A lot of people laugh about the idea of Christ returning. What do you mean Christ is going to return? Look around. Things are just like they've been since the beginning of time. But he points out the idea when God says something, it's going to happen. He uses the illustration of the flood. And so you have this idea that he talks about there, and notice the wording. The wording is very interesting. In verse 6, it says, the world that was, or that then was. And when you think about the destruction of the world, okay, what do you generally, what's the first variety or group of things that you think about when you think about flood and the destruction of the world?
Noah.
You think about people, don't you? I mean, that's generally how I think about it. You think about all these people who were destroyed in this flood. But notice verse 7, the contrast. It says, but the heavens and the earth which are now. Okay, you see the contrast between the two? The world that was then versus the heavens and the earth now. And so what he's talking about there, although humanity was in a sense destroyed in the flood, the emphasis that he's putting upon it is the destruction of the world itself. You know, this world in which we live is going to be destroyed by fire, the heavens and the earth. That world in which Noah lived, the heavens and the earth were destroyed by water. And I want us to kind of think about that idea and focus on that this morning. And so, talk about two different ideas or two different areas in which the physical world or the earth in which Noah lived was different than the world in which we live today. And hopefully, if you're wondering where we're going with this, hopefully at the end I can tie it all together for you. But I want to talk a little bit about the atmosphere isn't really the right words for it, but the environment, the physical environment of the world that existed back then. And so take your Bibles and go back to creation. Let's go back to the beginning when God first made, of course, the earth. And let's talk a little bit about what we know from reading the creation account. And somebody read verse 1 for us there, Genesis 1:1.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
Okay, so when you go read that verse, what do you think of when you think of God creating the earth? Now I know verse 1 is kind of a summation of all creation, and then you have the details following there, but what do you generally think of when you say God created the earth?
Well, I think you just automatically think he created it just like it is here.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, I mean, we think about, well, all these mountains, these structures, and these rivers, and, everything that's in it. God created that. But how does, somebody read verse 2, how does the Bible describe the beginning of the earth is?
The earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
Okay, so here's what we learned from those first two verses. We learned that in the beginning, what the earth looked like.
No form.
There was no form, right?
Void.
Was it fashioned and shaped like we think of it today? No. And what was it made of in the beginning?
Water.
It was just water. I mean, if you look at the first day of creation, what did God create the first day? Only one thing that he did, right? Yeah, light. Thank you, Andy. At the end of day one, the earth is still a mass of water, right? Formless, shapeless, void. Even at the end of day two, when you read about day two in creation, the earth is still just water. It's not until the third day. Look down in verse 9. It says, Then God said, Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth. Okay, that's day number 3. So it's not until the third day that you actually have dry land appearing upon the earth. Those previous 2 days, all you have is this concept of the earth is this shapeless void form of water. And so what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the earth begins water, right? So we have this concept a little bit, I think, now in our minds of, although the formless and shapeless is hard for me to imagine, but you have this concept of the beginning of the earth itself. So I want to rewind here. We read day 1 and looked at day 3 where dry land or the earth appears. I want to rewind to day 2. And let's read about what happens in day 2. Somebody read verses 6 through 8 for us here in Genesis 1.
God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the water. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so.
Can you get verse 8 for us?
And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning the second day.
Okay, so here's this idea. Day 1, you just have this mass of water. Day 2, God creates a firmament. Now, what does that word firmament mean? Do they have a different translation, or they have a good Bible notes to tell you a little bit about it?
Be the atmosphere with it.
okay, it was a divide, and that's a separation. And what did this divide or separate?
Heaven from earth.
What does it say? It separated the water. There was a separation that was made between the water, right? Now, God created this division, this expanse, and now, in between this expanse, there was water underneath it, and there was water above. And so, in day 2, you have that division. Now, what was that division? Somebody read verse 20 for us, and it tells us what this firmament is.
God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly and moving creatures that have life and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven.
Okay, so what is the firmament that divided the waters?
In the air or the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's the place where the birds fly, right? The birds were flying in the firmament that God created. And so you have this idea of what's under the firmament. Well, you have water underneath it. What's above? You have water above. And so God created this expanse or this division. It's the same word that's used of the sacrifice that Abraham makes in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 10. It says, Abraham divided the sacrifice. Well, the idea is he separated, he cut it. And so God inserted this atmosphere, this space in which the birds fly, to divide the waters or to separate the waters from below the earth that were from the waters that were above the earth. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we could probably pursue this and look at it, but here's what I want to emphasize to you, because a lot of people have said, well, the waters above the firmament were the clouds. Well, let me ask you this question. Where are the waters below the firmament? Are they in the firmament? No, they're underneath it, right? They're on the surface of the earth. So if the water's above the firmament, is it in it? Is it the clouds that's being spoken of here? No, there's something above it, right? The firmament was what separated. It wasn't in the middle of the firmament. The firmament separated. The firmament divided. And so there were waters that were underneath this firmament, and there were waters that were above this firmament. So here's I don't know how much time I'm going to have here and where I'll go with it, but here's a couple ideas to think about. If there was a water vapor canopy, and understand this, water can exist in 3 different forms, right? It can be in liquid, it can be in solid, or it can be in gas. Most likely this was steam, this was gas. It was a water vapor canopy that God created over the earth. Now, what do you think a water vapor canopy would do to the earth? Got any ideas?
Keep it moist.
Yeah, it would change the earth dramatically, right? Venus, I don't know how much you've studied a little, or some of the other planets, but Venus has a canopy around the planet. Part of that canopy is water. But here's what scientists know from studying Venus. Because of that canopy and makeup of it, the temperature from the poles in Venus, from the top to the bottom, they only vary by a couple degrees. And the temperatures between night and day, they only change just a couple of degrees between those times. So you kind of have this worldwide global climate. And you have this idea that not only is it a worldwide climate, but it's a very enjoyable climate. And another thing that it would do is this. What do you think why do things deteriorate here on Earth? Do you may know? What causes them to break down? Or one of the main causes, I guess I should say.
The sun, I would say.
Yeah, it's ultraviolet light, right? UV rays. We hear about those all the time. What causes the body to decay? What causes cancer? What causes physical things to break down? It's the intensity of the ultraviolet light. And so, if you had a water vapor canopy surrounding the earth, one of the things that it would do is it would cut out a lot of the harmful UV rays. You read back in the Bible about men living to be almost 1,000 years old. And people say, how did they live so long back there? What if the earth they lived in was different than the earth that we live in today? And what if something happened along the way that drastically changed the composition of the earth to help reduce the lifespan of mankind? Well, those are all good questions to think about. But if that water vapor canopy, which we read about there in Genesis chapter 1, it existed in the beginning. We know that, right? When God created it, there was water that was above the earth. But think about this, what was the earth like when God first made it?
Void without form.
Okay, but I'm talking about after man was introduced. What kind of world did man live in?
Or the rainforest.
It was a dream world, wasn't it? I mean, it was a paradise. You know, plants grew very easily. It was perfect for animals and for plants and for mankind. And one of the things that you read about in the Garden of Eden, God created this. The Bible says it was good, it was good, it was good. It was beautiful and perfect in every way that we could ever imagine. But when you read about Adam and Eve in the beginning, what were they not wearing?
Clothes.
Clothes. What does that tell you about the environment in which they lived? There's only two reasons you need clothes, okay? One of them is for modesty, right? And incidentally, why did God clothe Adam and Eve? Was it because they got cold?
No.
It was modesty, right? That's why God clothed them. But in the beginning, man didn't have a need for clothes. And you ask the question, could you live in our world today? They didn't have furnaces and AC like we have today. Could you live in our world today without clothes? No, you would die, right? You need that for protection. You need it for warmth. Man didn't need that in the beginning.
Only in the very tropical parts of the world you could, but most places you could.
Yeah, you're talking about those places where, again, you have adequate amount of temperature, where human life can be sustained and be comfortable in there. And so what would be some of the benefits of this water canopy? Well, warmth would be one of them. It would basically maintain the temperature of the earth, just varying a few degrees from the top to the bottom, and even from day to night it wouldn't change much. Another one would be long life. It would change how long man could live here up on earth. The atmospheric pressure would be great. You ever heard of an oxygen chamber? Where the oxygen is increased, the pressure is increased. What are the benefits of that? I don't think anybody here owns one, right?
You heal quicker.
Yeah, athletes, a lot of them, well, the rich ones have them in their own home. And they have them because they'll sleep in those chambers because it makes your body heal faster. And so there's a lot of benefits. It helps in fighting sickness. It helps in fighting disease. It helps fight the aging and the decaying process. And so there's a lot of benefits that come from that. Yes, Darrell?
I've got a question. I hadn't studied this, so I've got it clear in my head. But, plants, animals, everything needs a significant amount of sun to survive. This water canopy had to let sun through some or it wouldn't work,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it wasn't like a total blockage of the sun by any means. But the environment in which we live today as human beings and the atmospheric pressure and things like that, it's about as low as a human being can survive. That's the conditions that we live in today. If you start dropping the pressure much lower than this, humanity can't survive. But yeah, there's a lot of indications, that world, when God created it, remember, it was a dream world. It was paradise. And so sometimes we just think, well, this world today is just like it's always been. So God makes this firmament in the middle of this water. I'll get going here, okay. And another thing that's going to be different is moisture. Okay, how do we get moisture today? Rain, right? But if you have a water vapor canopy, if you have something that's holding all this heat in upon the earth, you know what you get a lot of? Dew, yes, heavy dew, right? And here's what we know from reading the Bible. There was no rain upon the earth. There's no evidence in the Bible that there was any rain upon the earth before the flood. In fact, somebody look at Genesis 2, 5, and 6. Somebody read it and tell us what that says.
And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground.
Okay. Did it rain in the beginning? How was the earth watered?
Missed.
Yeah, it was this mist that came up evidently from the rivers that flowed underneath, and the moisture that went underneath, and the constant temperature. But there was this mist that came up from underground that watered the whole earth. You don't read about any rain until Genesis 7:14, the first time you read about the flood. And incidentally, after Noah and his family come off the ark, God establishes a covenant with Noah, right? And remember, what was the sign of that covenant?
Rainbow.
A rainbow. And so he says, when you see this rainbow, you'll remember my promise. Here's my question. Hadn't they seen a rainbow before? I mean, if you've seen this constantly, and, you said, well, how can that be a reminder? I saw that before the flood ever came, right? What changed? Something changed. What do you have to have a rainbow?
Sun.
Okay, rain, right? Water droplets in the atmosphere.
Sun.
Clouds, yeah, sun. All those things are necessary. And so what it indicates to us is after the flood, there had been a drastic change in the environment. Now the world was going to be watered through these clouds and through the rain. Before, there wasn't any indication that it had been that way. In fact, when you think about today, when you think about why do we get rain and why do we have all these fluctuating temperatures? Well, you have high pressure and low pressure, right? You have warm fronts and you have cold fronts. You have these tremendous winds that push these things around. That probably wasn't there in Noah's day. Okay, all those are the result of the change in the atmosphere. And now the world is going to be different than what it was before.
Just a side note, it just made me think, in California, these huge redwood trees, they get a large amount of their water from the fog that comes in off the ocean,
Yeah.
rather than rain.
Yeah, and there's mountains like that too, in Israel and other places like that where, because of where they reach, that's basically their main source, their main water source for the year. So, is it possible that the world drastically changed whenever the flood came? I say not only is it possible, but there's enough biblical evidence to say it changed. How drastically, I can't say for sure. But there is a reference, a couple of passages you can look at here. Psalm 33, verses 6 and 7. It talks about how when God created the earth, He laid up the deep in storehouses. And remember what happens when the flood comes? The Bible says God opens the windows of heaven. What happens when you open a window? Remember all that water that God put around the earth? When He opened the window that was in heaven, what was keeping that water from coming down? It was the firmament, right? It was the heaven. When you open the window of heaven, what's going to happen? All that water is going to come down. And so it's kind of indicative. People say, well, what happened? Why isn't that water vapor canopy there today? The biblical evidence suggests that in the flood, God opened up the windows of heaven and allowed all this water. Now remember, God knew this was going to happen long before it ever did, right? Do you think He prepared for this time? Yeah, He was prepared when it came. He knew exactly what was going to happen. And so He had already prepared, He had already created the world for this situation. And so He just opens the windows of heaven, and all this water that was above the firmament, above the sky, pours out upon the earth. And the implications of that's not all my study. That's another lesson. I don't know how much those guys will get into it, but I'm just going to stick with what I'm supposed to talk about. So the first thing is the difference in the atmosphere. The second thing that I'd like to point out here is the arrangement, I guess we should say, of the dry land. Because there's this, you probably heard it taught in science and even probably studied it in school, if not your children, your grandchildren will talk to you about it because it's obviously one of those things that are being talked about today. But there's this idea in science that sometime in the history of the world there was this supercontinent. All the continents that we know of today that are separate from one another, that they were all joined together at one time. And that idea, it was advanced in different ways, but it probably really wasn't made famous until 1915, where a guy wrote a book called The Origin of Continents and the Oceans. And in that book, he alleged that all of these continents had been at one time together. And he called that concept Pangea. It's the idea, it basically means all or one world. And so you'll see that in science. You may have studied it. If not, your children will probably talk to you about it, or your grandchildren. And so what I want us to think about is, we studied about the atmosphere of the earth changed. Is it possible that the dry land changed too? Well, not only is it possible, it's very, very probable. Because there were some dramatic things that were going on in the flood. And so, think about this. In Genesis 1 verse 9, when God makes the dry land appear, going back to creation, it says that all the water was in one place. So here's my question. If all the water was in one place, where was all the dry land? Wouldn't it make sense that it was all in one place too? I mean, wouldn't that be the natural thinking or the idea behind the verse? And so, no dry land appears until the third day. When it appears, all the water is in one place. Now, a couple of things to think about. Here's what scientists tell us. Scientists tell us that the Earth's tectonic plates are moving at a rate of 8 centimeters per year. This isn't a science class. I'm not going to teach about tectonic plates or continental movement or things like that, but they're relevant to what we're studying here. And basically, it just means this. If you look at the physical evidence, the continents are moving. Okay, and they're moving at a rate of 8 centimeters per year. Now, how long is that? Well, it's about as fast as your fingernails grow. So you can't just sit down and stare at the continent for an hour and say, well, it's not moving again. It's not going to happen like that. And so here's what scientists do. They say if you rewind the movement of the continents, it would take 300 million years to put all these continents back together into one place. Okay, so 300 million years ago, here's what they teach. Some catastrophic event happened that moved or set these continents into motion, or else they have the idea they've always been moving and this isn't the first supercontinent that ever happened in the history of the world. Depending on which science teacher, I guess, you would study under. But is there scientific evidence that continents are moving? Yes, there is. So how does that relate to the idea of the flood? Well, a couple of things that I want to point out. First of all, is this. Why would somebody believe that? Because this guy in 1915 obviously wasn't measuring the movement of the continents, right? But here's what he did notice. He said, if you look at the shorelines of these continents, they fit together. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you take them and you put them next to each other, it's like they fit together and they broke off from one another. So if you look at some of the makeup of the continents, you'll find that is really the case. And here's what got scientists interested in this. They started looking at the rock layers between continents, and here's what they noticed. There was a consistency. If you went across the ocean to the continent that was next to you, there was a consistency in the rock layers and in the fossil evidence. It's like they lined up. It's like something had split them in half, and now the Atlantic Ocean or some other ocean is separating them from one another. And so it got them interested, saying, hey, maybe it was the case that all these continents were at one time united in some way. And again, if you look at the fossil record, you'll see that. You'll see the fossil record spanning continents. And again, if you'll take those continents and you'll line them up, what you'll find is that fossil record runs right through those continents like they were joined together at one time. And so you have all these different fossil evidences. I was going to talk a little bit about it, but I don't have time to do that. And what else do you have? Well, another interesting thing is the mountain ranges. If you'll take these continents and you'll line them up, what you'll find is these mountain ranges even line up. So once again, you have this evidence that at one time, these were all put together, they were all one continent. Now, here's a couple of things that I want you to take home from this particular idea. Look at Antarctica. And what you see in Antarctica, you see this fossil line that's running through Antarctica. Some interesting fossils. have been found on Antarctica. Anybody know what Antarctica is like? It's the frozen tundra, right? So here's what one of the fossils that they find in Antarctica. It's a tropical fern plant. What in the world is a tropical fern doing in Antarctica? You know, there's evidence that at one time Antarctica isn't what it is today. It was different, maybe even a tropical world. And also they found a dinosaur bone, or well, many dinosaur bones, but the jaw of the dinosaur. This was a particular one that was unearthed in Antarctica. Anybody know what kind of animal a dinosaur is?
Reptile.
Yeah, reptile, right? What do you know about a reptile?
Warm environment.
Warm environment, warm-blooded. It has to live in a warm environment where it can't survive. Could a dinosaur have lived in Antarctica? Well, not today it could. But what if Antarctica wasn't always like it is today? What if there was a warm environment that once existed in Antarctica and something changed, and when the environment changed, this dinosaur died, and the fossil was preserved, and so now you have evidence once again that Antarctica today isn't necessarily what it's always been. So, is there evidence that the world in which we live today isn't the same world in which Noah lived? The answer is yes. The question becomes this: what changed? What happened? And science has this way of trying to explain things. Well, you need 300 million years, or you need 4.5 billion years, to explain all these different things. And they say that because it's this idea, it's the assumption of uniformity. Peter talks about it in 2 Peter 3 verse 4. Here's what they say: all things continue as they were from the beginning. And so if you're going to say the present is the key to the past, in other words, every geological phenomenon that we see in our world today, you can explain it as the result of a force that is already in existence. And so that force operated uniformly over time in order to accomplish this. You know what they say when they look at the Grand Canyon? Anybody been there? What do they tell you? How was the Grand Canyon formed?
By the river.
This Colorado River, right? How much time do you think it would take for the Colorado River to carve out the Grand Canyon? Well, if all things continue as they were from the beginning, it would take a lot of time. But that's the doctrine of uniformity. Is there another explanation? Yes. And that's where the biblical idea comes in. It's this idea that God is in control, that God made everything, that He has power and control over things, and at any time that He wants, and for any reason that He wants, He can dip into that universe and that creation and do whatever He wants. And you know what that allows for? It allows for greater changes to take place in a very short period of time. And that's basically the flood, friends. There's a lot of things that the flood changed. There's a lot of reasons why we see the geological formations that we see today. Does it have to be explained by time? No. Not if you believe the Bible. Not if you believe there's a supernatural being who's in control and does whatever He wants with this world and this universe. It's very easy to explain. And in fact, it makes a lot more sense. I think you'll find as you go through this week, it makes a lot more sense than some of the explanation that scientists have tried to offer us today. And so the main point and the takeaway that I want for you to get from this is, again, can the physical condition, the changes that we see, scientists tell us this world has changed, right? Can that be backed up by biblical evidence? The answer is yes. The Bible proves it. The Bible talks about it. A lot of those changes came whenever the flood happened. A lot of those changes in the landmass, a lot of those changes in the atmosphere came whenever God brought this universal catastrophe upon this earth. And so, I think what the world wants you to think about today is science and Bible evidence can't be harmonized. Well, it can. It can't be harmonized by their theories, the theories of men, and the scientific theories that they offer us. But it can be harmonized by the evidence that the Bible offers to us. So I hope that helps somebody. If not, maybe it'll help you when you talk to your kids or your grandkids or something like that. Do you have any comments or questions or anything